Greetings and salutations, everybody. Welcome to another Dracula entry here, as I'd been wanting to work in some other adaptations that I hadn't seen previously, particularly from the 70s, as I'd recently revisited Horror of Dracula, aka just Dracula by Hammer Films, starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And of course they made a lot of those over the course of a little bit over 10 years. And then into the 70s there were some other installments by other companies that I just never got around to checking out. So I figured this would be a good kind of series to continue that. So for this one I went to the 1979 Dracula, starring Frank Langella and as Dracula, and directed by John Badham, who later on brought us films such as Blue Thunder, War Games, and Short Circuit, to name a few. And the synopsis for this one is, well, Dracula. Well, in particular, it states, in 1913, the charming, seductive, and sinister vampire Count Dracula travels to England in search of an immortal bride. So, this one in particular had been on my want to watch someday list for quite a while, for several years. And I could swear that I'd likely seen some of it back on cable, or on cable back in the day when I was much younger, but really none of this film had kind of rang a bell. Now, as expected, there were tons of changes from the book and even from other adaptations that I'd seen, you know, some major differences. But some of what kind of stuck out most in this interpretation was more concentration at the beginning on the Demeter as being our main connection to Dracula, rather than Harker arriving at the castle and so on. None of the Harker showing up at the castle to secure property or write up legal documents, or as in the Hammer film, you know, pose as a librarian. Instead, this has more to do, as far as the introduction goes, as Dracula arriving, the ship was run aground and cargo is being sent to Carfax Abbey, and getting to see more of how like castle-like this location is. Also for this one, unlike the Hammer one, we do have the Renfield character helping out as well, being obsessed with eating the bugs to get their energy, which we didn't have in that Hammer entry. And even some focus that all that was being shipped really in those boxes was earth to his from his estate, something that he passes off as having an interest in botany. But even more than that introduction being a tad different was Dracula himself. We get much less of the shadowy mystery around him, in my opinion, and much more romantic intrigue. As he hobnobs with our other characters, more than I'd seen in the Horror of Dracula. Though some of this I had seen in other interpretations, in this there was a bit more that made him feel a little bit more open and vulnerable, not as mysterious, as far as what we know about him going into this, of his secret being a vampire. He's just like any other aristocrat attending this social function. He's schmoozing and mingling, getting the attention of some of the women, and even helping one of them with some pain she was feeling by working a little bit of like hypnotism, that vampire allure that we've seen touches on here and there. Now, he's definitely not as threatening right off the bat, despite what we know of him, and he's definitely more of a romantic figure. Even the poster has the quote, throughout history he has filled the hearts of men with terror and the hearts of women with desire, leaning much more into that romantic side. Now, I've seen, you know, the love story aspect much more apparent in like the Coppola version before, but again, I'm trying not to compare too much, but I do have a lot of those other interpretations kind of fresh in my head. You know, I still tried to ignore the changes from the book or the differences that I'd seen in those other interpretations as best I could, and just sit back and enjoy this one for what they were presenting with this adaptation. And there was some stuff to like, definitely, for sure. You know, I liked seeing this different version of Dracula, not quite as creepy, but more alluring. Gave a bit more of a connection to Dracula rather than being quite as enigmatic, you know, which also subdued the horror a little bit here and there. And skipping past the Harker meeting Dracula stuff to focus on the Demeter, just getting us to that, you know, getting him settled in London worked really well for me. I never really felt like I had enough Demeter in some of the other interpretations, which now that I've been going through this video, I definitely want to rewatch that, The Last Voyage of Demeter, which I really enjoyed. Anyways, there were even aspects of the overall style that I enjoyed, to a point, such as at the beginning having some black and white footage worked into it. You know, here and there, and these like muted colors, which were kind of like a nice change for a bit, in that it felt like it bridged the older Lugosi-led one, you know, that old black and white one, with a little bit more newer stuff, like as it's ushering us into the 70s at the time, or this case, the end of the 70s. So with those changes, it did help feel a bit more different from other interpretations I'd seen, rather than rehashing too much about it, which of course helped me drop the comparisons a little bit. Because, well, the first 30 minutes kept me fully on board, again, because of those changes, making it feel fresh, But by the time, especially that we got to that 45-minute mark, things just really felt like they slowed down. The story moved along and was familiar enough, I was familiar enough with it to be able to follow overall and kind of keep up with it, but it just felt like it was dragging. I feel like the story easily could have been whittled down to under 90 minutes. Yet this one was like a solid hour and 50 minutes. It just felt padded, and it could have easily been edited down to at least chop off 15 minutes from this. And on top of that, the interesting black and white style, or the black and white then to be into those muted tones. Well, I wasn't actually even sure if it used black and white when I was thinking back on it. I had to rewatch the beginning and confirmed, yeah, there were some black and white shots at the beginning, and then it ushered us into color, but it was at least on the edition that I had, a very muted color palette. So, yeah, in some ways it kind of felt like it bridged the old black and white to newer ones in color, but just the muted colors really started to drag it down a bit. Like, for example, in the Hammer films, or even in the Coppola one, I would see this color palette, kind of bringing us along, but then they would make something really pop with the color red usually. But for this film, that interesting tone just was kind of played out and made it feel very drab. There was nothing to pop out of that. So when you throw that in with this much slower pace that was, kind of coming in at around that 45-minute mark, I found that back half of the film, up until at least like the last few minutes of the actual climax, to be a bit hard to kind of stay engaged with. The muted visuals, the slower pace, and working on that slow burn romance and tension that they had for this. The performances were fine, but just the energy was low. The color was too drab for too long, so it turned from an interesting style, all that borderline black and white creepiness to it, especially for certain shots, to a point where I just figured, okay, this needs to pop soon. Something needs to come out of this. More color, like, I don't know, blood, for instance, would have been a nice touch. So things like that kind of got in the way. But all in all, I would assume that when this came out, people were excited to see a new interpretation, as it had been 20 years since the first Hammer film. And then that franchise went through many changes and updates, and it finally kind of ended, I believe, in 73 or 75. And of course, it had been even longer since a very popular Lugosi-led film. So all of that with that romantic side, I can see how, concentrating on those other aspects, working in that black and white feel, that for some, they probably found this at the time to be more than worth checking out. And speaking of checking out, thanks for checking out my quick video here for the latest Dracula entry that I checked out from 1979, starring Frank Langella. To the time of this video, is only available on paid rental. It does have its moments, but ultimately though, even though I was just trying not to do the comparisons, I would so recommend that Hammer entry over this one, especially since it's free on Tubi. I feel like it will be also increasingly difficult for me to not make too many comparisons to other entries that I've watched. Any other interpretations, as I go through. I have two more Dracula films in particular that I want to check out. The final one, if I do enjoy it, may end up getting me to check out a sequel to it as well. So those will be coming up over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks. Yeah, so because of that, if you enjoy, please give me a thumbs up, and if not already a subscriber, consider subscribing and hitting that bell to get notification when I post them, and swing by every Friday morning around 8 a.m. Eastern Time. That's when I do post. Occasionally I post the same time on Monday. I say that because I still seem to be in some sort of algorithm timeout where I haven't even had a video cross 100 views since early November, yet I've got, at the time of this video, over 800 subscribers, so I don't know what's going on. But, so just be sure to come by and check back, and with that, thanks again for coming by, and I will see you in the next one.